God will show up unexpectedly in your life. There is a quiet assumption many people carry without ever speaking it aloud, that if God intends to act, he will do so loudly, clearly, and on a timetable we can circle on a calendar. We imagine thunder, signs in the sky, a neatly arranged sequence of cause and effect. Yet the history of faith, and the private history of every honest believer, tells a far stranger story. God, it seems, has a fondness for interruptions. He steps into ordinary moments without warning, not because he enjoys surprise for its own sake, but because surprise exposes what routine has carefully hidden. We grow accustomed to managing our lives as though God were a distant consultant, rather than a living presence. Then, without announcement, he appears, not always with answers, but often with a question that rearranges everything. Most people expect God to arrive when they are prepared, composed, and morally impressive, but preparedness is rarely the condition for divine arrival. More often, God shows up when the heart is tired of pretending it is in control. He comes when the plans are sensible, well-researched, and utterly insufficient. He comes when you have done everything right and still find yourself staring at a locked door. It is there, in that awkward space between effort and exhaustion, that the unexpected footstep is heard. Not because you earned it, but because you finally noticed you were not meant to walk alone. There is something unsettling about this kind of arrival. We like predictable help. We like assistance that confirms our strategy. But God's help has a way of questioning the strategy itself. When he shows up unexpectedly, he often exposes how small our expectations have been. We asked for improvement, he offers transformation. We asked for relief, he offers purpose. We asked for escape, he offers endurance with meaning. This is not cruelty. It is mercy of a deeper sort, the kind that refuses to leave us shallow when depth is possible. Many believers quietly fear that God has overlooked them because nothing dramatic has happened. They imagine that divine action belongs to other people with louder testimonies. But God's unexpected arrival is not measured by spectacle. Sometimes it is a thought that refuses to go away. Sometimes it is a conversation that lingers long after it ends. Sometimes it is a sudden strength to endure what yesterday felt unbearable. These are not coincidences dressed up as comfort. They are interventions disguised as ordinary moments. God is remarkably unashamed of subtlety. The problem is not that God does not show up. The problem is that we have trained ourselves to recognize him only in forms we find convenient. We look for rescue when he is offering companionship. We look for answers when he is offering himself. And so we pass through moments thick with meaning, unaware that heaven has brushed against our routine. Yet even then, God is patient. He does not storm out because he is unrecognized. He waits, knowing that sooner or later the soul will grow curious about the peace it cannot explain. There are seasons when God's silence feels like absence. In those seasons, faith is tempted to shrink into a contract. If God will act, then I will trust. But the unexpected arrival of God dismantles that bargain. He shows up not as a response to our conditions, but as a reminder that he was never bound by them. Often, the very delay we interpret as neglect is the space in which our false certainties quietly collapse. And when they do, there is room for something sturdier to be built. Consider how often God enters human stories through disruption. Comfort rarely produces courage. Ease rarely produces faith. It is interruption that awakens us. When God shows up unexpectedly, he interrupts not to destroy, but to reorder. He challenges the assumption that your life is defined by its worst chapter. He challenges the lie that you have missed your moment beyond repair. Divine interruption is not the erasing of your past, but the reclaiming of it. Nothing wasted, nothing ignored, everything woven. There is a particular kindness in the way God surprises those who think they are beyond surprise. When hope feels irresponsible, when prayer feels mechanical, when belief feels more like habit than fire, God steps in quietly and proves that he is not a theory you inherited, but a presence who pursues. He does not always remove the weight, but he alters the balance. Suddenly, what once crushed you becomes something you can carry, not because you became stronger on your own, but because you discovered you were being held. People often ask why God does not announce himself more clearly. Yet clarity, as we usually mean it, would leave us unchanged. If God appeared only in predictable ways, we would fit him neatly into our systems and keep our lives largely untouched. The unexpected arrival of God prevents that. It forces a reckoning. It demands humility. It asks whether we are willing to be led rather than merely assisted. God does not wish to be an accessory to our plans. He wishes to be the center of our lives. When God shows up unexpectedly, he often does so at the edge of our understanding. Not everything is explained. Not every question is answered. But something unmistakable occurs, the sense that you are no longer alone in the story. This awareness does not remove mystery. It makes mystery bearable. Faith, after all, is not certainty about outcomes. It is trust in presence. And presence, once experienced, cannot be unexperienced. There is also a gentle irony in divine surprise. We say we want God to move, yet we resist the movement that would be required if he did. We ask for change, but cling to familiarity. So God, in his mercy, comes sideways. He enters through the back door of our expectations. He meets us not where we perform best, but where we are most honest. And honesty, once invited, has a way of unlocking doors pride kept shut. Some will recognize God's unexpected arrival only in hindsight. Looking back, they will see that a closed door saved them from a future they could not have survived. They will see that a delay refined them rather than denied them. They will see that what felt like abandonment was, in truth, a form of guidance too gentle to be recognized at the time. God is not offended by our delayed understanding. He is committed to our eventual awakening. What makes these moments unmistakably divine is not their drama, but their fruit. After God shows up unexpectedly, something changes at the root. Fear loses its authority. Despair loses its final word. Life, even when difficult, regains meaning. This is not optimism, it is orientation. The soul begins to face the right direction again. And direction, more than speed, determines where a life will end up. There are those who believe God only visits holy places and holy people. Yet the record of faith tells a different story. God seems remarkably comfortable in the ordinary, the broken, the overlooked. He shows up in kitchens and prisons, on roads and in waiting rooms, in moments that would never be labeled sacred by human standards. This is not because holiness is unimportant, but because God's presence is what makes a place holy in the first place. If God were predictable, he would be manageable, and a manageable God would be no God at all. The unexpected arrival of God preserves both his mystery and our freedom. He does not coerce belief, he invites response. When he shows up, the question is never whether he is real, but whether we are willing to listen, willing to trust, willing to let go of the small story we have been telling ourselves in exchange for something truer and larger. You may be closer to such a moment than you realize. Often, the nearness of God is disguised as restlessness, a dissatisfaction with shallow answers, a hunger nothing familiar seems to satisfy. These are not signs of faith failing, but of faith waking up. God's unexpected arrival is often preceded by a quiet discomfort with the status quo. The soul senses that there must be more, and God, hearing that unspoken prayer, begins to draw near. When he comes, he will not necessarily confirm your assumptions. He may unsettle them. He may call you to forgive when you plan to withdraw, to stay when you plan to leave, to trust when you plan to protect yourself. This is not because God enjoys difficulty, but because love, if it is real, must be allowed to reshape us. And reshaping, by its nature, is uncomfortable before it is beautiful. Yet even in that discomfort, there is a strange peace. Not the peace of everything being easy, but the peace of everything being held. When God shows up unexpectedly, he does not remove you from reality, he anchors you within it. The storm may continue, but it no longer defines the horizon. Something greater has entered the frame, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. So if you find yourself waiting, uncertain or weary, do not assume God is absent. He may be nearer than you think, preparing to arrive in a way you did not predict and could not have planned. His timing will not flatter your impatience, but it will honor your becoming, and when he does show up, it will not merely be to fix a moment, but to reveal a presence that was with you even before you noticed, walking quietly beside you, ready to speak into the very place where you least expected him to appear, shaping your story from the inside out as you continue forward, unaware that what feels like an ending is slowly being transformed into a beginning that has not yet fully revealed its shape or its demand on your faith, but is already calling you to listen more carefully than you ever have before. That call to listen more carefully does not arrive as a shout. It is more often a pressure, gentle but persistent, like a hand, resting on the shoulder when you were certain no one was behind you. At first you may doubt it. You may assume it is imagination, fatigue, or wishful thinking. Yet it remains steady and patient, refusing to be dismissed. This is often how God begins to show up unexpectedly, not by overwhelming the senses, but by awakening attentiveness. He draws the soul into a posture of listening before he ever asks it to move. Listening, however, is uncomfortable for a generation trained to explain everything. Silence feels unproductive. Waiting feels like failure. But God is not in a hurry to compete with our noise. He allows us to exhaust ourselves with constant motion until we finally admit that speed has not given us clarity. Then, in that honest fatigue, the unexpected nearness of God becomes perceptible. We realize that what we called emptiness was actually space, and space was necessary for him to be known. There is a misconception that God's unexpected arrival will instantly make life simpler. In truth, it often makes life clearer, and clarity can be demanding. When God shows up, excuses lose their power. Self-deception becomes harder to maintain. The comforting lies we told ourselves begin to feel thin. This is not condemnation, it is illumination. God does not expose in order to shame, but to heal. Yet healing requires the courage to see what is truly there. Many people would prefer a God who fixes circumstances without touching the heart. But God's interest is deeper than comfort. He knows that a changed environment with an unchanged heart eventually recreates the same pain. So when he arrives unexpectedly, he often begins inwardly. He rearranges priorities. He challenges loyalties. He invites surrender in places we did not realize we were guarding. This inner work is quiet, but its consequences are lasting. There are moments when this process feels like loss. Old desires fade. Certain ambitions lose their shine. Relationships shift. The familiar patterns that once defined you no longer fit. It is tempting in such moments to assume something has gone wrong, yet this is often evidence that God is very much at work. Growth always involves leaving something behind. God does not strip away without intention, he clears space for what cannot grow otherwise. Unexpected divine presence also reframes suffering. Pain does not suddenly become pleasant, but it becomes meaningful. Instead of asking only how to escape it, the soul begins to ask what it is being shaped for. God does not romanticize suffering, but he refuses to let it be pointless. When he shows up, even wounds begin to speak, not of defeat, but of depth. They testify that you have been to places shallow faith could not survive. One of the most startling effects of God's unexpected arrival is how it changes our understanding of weakness. What we once tried to hide becomes the very place God chooses to work. Not because weakness is admirable, but because it is honest. Strength built on illusion collapses under pressure. Strength built on dependence endures. God does not need your performance, he desires your trust. And trust grows best where control has failed. There is also a strange freedom that follows. When you realize that God can enter your life without your permission or planning, you are released from the exhausting task of managing everything. This does not make you passive. It makes you available. You still act, still choose, still work, but without the crushing belief that everything depends on you. Responsibility remains, but it is no longer lonely. God's unexpected presence also reshapes prayer. It becomes less about persuasion and more about alignment, less about convincing God to act, and more about noticing where he already is. Words matter less, honesty matters more. Silence becomes prayer, Attention becomes worship. Life itself becomes conversation. You begin to realize that prayer was never meant to pull God into your world, but to awaken you to His. As this awareness deepens, fear begins to lose its dominance. Not because uncertainty disappears, but because it is no longer faced alone. Fear thrives on isolation. God's presence disrupts that isolation. Even when outcomes remain unclear, the heart steadies. Courage grows, not as confidence in success, but as confidence in companionship. You may still tremble, but you no longer retreat. It is important to note that God's unexpected arrival does not make you immune to doubt. In fact, it often sharpens it. But doubt, when met honestly, becomes a doorway rather than a dead end. It strips faith of sentimentality and forces it to mature. God is not threatened by your questions. He is threatened only by your refusal to engage. When He shows up, He invites the whole self, certainty and uncertainty alike, into relationship. Over time, you may notice that your sense of value changes. You no longer measure yourself solely by productivity, approval, or visible success. Something steadier takes root. Worth becomes grounded in belonging rather than achievement. This is a quiet revolution. It does not announce itself loudly, but it alters how you walk through the world. You become less reactive, less desperate, less easily shaken. God's unexpected presence also changes how you see others. Compassion grows where judgment once lived. You recognize your own fragility in their struggles. You become slower to condemn and quicker to listen, not because you excuse wrongdoing, but because you understand the complexity of the human heart. Grace, once received, becomes difficult to withhold. There will be days when this awareness feels distant again. Faith is not a constant emotional high. Familiar doubts may return, circumstances may press hard. Yet even then, something has shifted. You remember enough to keep going. You have tasted presence, and memory sustains you when feeling does not. God does not withdraw to punish your weakness. He remains, even when perception fades. In time, you may realize that what you once called an unexpected arrival was actually a revelation of a presence that had been constant all along. God did not suddenly decide to care. He simply found you ready to notice. Readiness, it turns out, is not perfection but openness, a willingness to be interrupted, a courage to admit need. This realization humbles without humiliating. It frees without making careless. You understand that your life is not a solo performance, but a shared story. Decisions matter. Choices carry weight. Yet grace runs deeper than failure. Hope extends further than fear. God's involvement is not fragile. It does not depend on your flawless consistency. As you continue forward, the world does not become less complex, but you become less lost within it. You develop an inner company, empaths, shaped not by trends or pressures, but by a quiet fidelity. You begin to live less from impulse and more from conviction. This is not rigidity, it is rootedness, and rootedness allows flexibility without collapse. God's unexpected presence also redefines success. Instead of asking only whether something works, you ask whether it is faithful. Instead of chasing constant expansion, you value depth. Instead of fearing obscurity, you discover meaning in obedience unseen by others. The applause of the world grows quieter. The approval of conscience grows louder. You may still hope for visible breakthroughs, and rightly so. God is not opposed to blessing. But you learn that the greatest gift was not the change of circumstance, but the change of center. Your life no longer revolves solely around self-preservation. Love begins to take precedence over safety. Purpose outweighs comfort. And though this path is not easier, it is truer. In ways you cannot fully articulate, you become more whole, not flawless, not finished, but integrated. Faith is no longer an accessory to life, it becomes its lens. You interpret joy differently, suffering differently, time differently. Eternity begins to press gently into the present, giving weight to ordinary choices. And still, God remains surprising. Just when you think you have learned His patterns, He moves again in a way that confounds expectation. This is not instability, it is vitality. A living God cannot be reduced to formulas. Each new movement invites deeper trust, wider surrender, fuller life. So you walk on, attentive but not anxious, purposeful but not rigid, aware that the God who has already shown up unexpectedly is not finished revealing himself. And though you cannot yet see how the next chapter will unfold, you sense that the same presence that met you before will meet you again, perhaps in another ordinary moment, another interruption, another quiet turning point, continuing to shape you, guide you, and draw you further into a story that is still being written, still unfolding, still calling you forward even now as the journey goes on. Even now, as that journey continues, there is a growing awareness that faith is not primarily about reaching a destination, but about learning to recognize companionship along the way. The road does not suddenly smooth out, nor do the questions evaporate, but the traveler is changed. You begin to sense that God's unexpected presence was not a single event to be archived in memory, but a pattern that quietly repeats itself in different forms, each time inviting deeper trust. What once startled you now steadies you. What once confused you now teaches you patience. There are moments when life seems almost deliberately ordinary, as though nothing of consequence could possibly be happening. Yet it is often in these stretches of apparent monotony that God does his most subtle work. Character is shaped there. Attention is refined there. The soul learns endurance not through dramatic victories, but through faithful persistence. God does not despise these slow seasons. He inhabits them. And when he shows up unexpectedly within them, it is not to entertain but to anchor. This anchoring changes how you face disappointment. Where once disappointment felt like evidence of divine absence, it now becomes an invitation to look again. You learn to ask not only what failed, but what is being formed. God does not always shield his people from disappointment, but he refuses to let disappointment have the final interpretation. When he is present, even unmet expectations can become instruments of wisdom rather than sources of bitterness. There is also a growing tenderness toward your own limitations. The harsh inner voice that once demanded constant proof of worth begins to soften. You realize that God was never impressed by your frantic striving, nor disappointed by your humanity. His unexpected arrival dismantles the illusion that love must be earned. Slowly, you learn to rest, not in inactivity, but in acceptance. And acceptance, paradoxically, becomes the soil from which the most meaningful effort grows. As this understanding deepens, time itself seems to change texture. You become less haunted by the past and less obsessed with the future. Regret loosens its grip. Anxiety loses some of its urgency. This does not mean you stop remembering or planning, but you stop living exclusively in either direction. The present moment becomes more inhabitable, and it is here, in the present, that God most often reveals himself. God's unexpected presence also reshapes the way you interpret obedience. It no longer feels like compliance with an external demand, but cooperation with an inner truth. Commands are understood as descriptions of life's proper alignment, rather than arbitrary tests of loyalty. Obedience becomes less about fear of punishment and more about desire for wholeness. You begin to see that God's guidance is not restrictive, but protective, like the banks of a river that allow the water to move with power rather than chaos. At Tim's, this realization brings sorrow. You recognize how often you resisted grace, how many moments of quiet invitation you ignored because they did not arrive in dramatic packaging. But even this sorrow is different now. It is not paralyzing shame, but cleansing regret. God does not rehearse your failures, he redeems them. He weaves even resistance into understanding, turning hindsight into humility. Unexpected divine presence also alters your relationship with success. Achievements still matter, but they no longer define you. You learn to hold success lightly, aware of how quickly it can disappear. Gratitude replaces entitlement, celebration replaces comparison. You begin to enjoy good things without demanding that they guarantee lasting security. God's nearness loosens your grip on outcomes without draining your passion for excellence. In relationships, this presence introduces a new patience. You become less hurried to fix others and more willing to accompany them. Advice gives way to empathy. Listening becomes an act of faith. You trust that God is at work in lives you cannot control, just as He was at work in yours long before you recognized Him. This trust does not make you passive, it makes you compassionate. There are still days when the unexpected feels unwelcome. When God interrupts plans you worked hard to build, the heart may resist. Faith does not eliminate frustration, but over time a pattern emerges. The interruptions that once felt cruel often prove necessary. God's redirections, though initially disorienting, frequently save you from smaller lives than the ones you were created to live. This realization does not remove the sting, but it adds perspective. You begin to notice that God's presence is often clearest, not in moments of triumph, but in moments of surrender. When you finally admit that you cannot carry everything alone, when you allow yourself to be seen without armor, something shifts. Grace rushes in where pride once stood guard. God does not humiliate you in surrender, He meets you there, and meeting Him there changes how you understand strength. Strength becomes less about dominance and more about resilience, less about control and more about faithfulness. You learn that it is possible to be strong and gentle at the same time, firm and flexible, committed and humble. This balance does not come naturally. It is cultivated through repeated encounters with a God who refuses to fit into your extremes. The unexpected presence of God also reframes vocation. Work becomes more than survival or status. It becomes participation. Whether your labor is visible or hidden, it carries dignity. You understand that God's concern is not limited to sacred spaces or explicitly religious tasks. He delights in faithfulness wherever it is found. This realization infuses ordinary responsibilities with quiet significance. There may come a moment when you recognize that the very thing you once feared, losing control, has become the doorway to peace. Control promised safety but delivered anxiety. Trust, though risky, delivers rest. This does not mean abandoning wisdom or responsibility. It means releasing the illusion of ultimate authorship. You are a steward, not the source. And that distinction is liberating. As seasons change, you notice that God's unexpected arrival often coincides with transitions. Endings make space for beginnings, though the space itself can feel frightening. God does not always explain the transition in advance. He asks you to walk by trust rather than by sight. Yet each step taken in faith reveals enough light for the next. The path is disclosed gradually, not withheld cruelly. Memory also becomes a companion rather than an accuser. You recall previous moments of divine faithfulness and allow them to inform present courage. The past is no longer a museum of mistakes, but a testimony of grace. You learn to tell your story differently, not omitting pain, but interpreting it through the lens of presence. God's unexpected arrival gives coherence to chapters that once felt disconnected. There is a growing reverence in you, not the brittle kind born of fear, but the living kind born of wonder. You are no longer casual about God, yet you are not terrified of Him either. Awe replaces anxiety. You understand that mystery is not a threat to faith, but its companion. God remains beyond comprehension, yet intimately near. This nearness does not make you immune to loneliness, but it transforms it. Loneliness becomes less a verdict on your worth and more a signal of your capacity for connection. You learn to bring loneliness into God's presence rather than letting it drive you into distraction. And in that presence, even solitude can become fruitful. As your inner life deepens, your outer life begins to reflect a quieter confidence. You speak less to impress and more to be truthful. You act less to be seen and more to be faithful. These shifts may go unnoticed by many, but they are noticed by the one who matters. God's unexpected arrival trains you to value that recognition above all. Others. You may still long for clarity, for unmistakable signs, for certainty that removes all risk. But you come to see that risk is not the enemy of faith, it is its environment. Trust requires something at stake. God does not eliminate uncertainty because uncertainty keeps relationship alive. A faith without risk would be little more than agreement. There will be moments ahead when God surprises you again, perhaps through joy you did not anticipate or through challenges you did not choose. When those moments come, you may remember how He has shown up before, not always as you hoped, but always as you needed. This memory does not make you fearless, but it makes you faithful. Gradually you realize that your life has become a kind of listening. You move through days attentive to subtle invitations, small nudges, quiet convictions. You do not assume every impulse is divine, but you remain open. Discernment grows alongside humility. You learn to test without cynicism and to trust without naivety. And so the story continues, not neatly resolved, not fully explained, but deeply inhabited. The God who shows up unexpectedly does not rush the ending. He walks the middle with you. He teaches you to live with unanswered questions without losing hope, to carry responsibility without losing joy, to move forward without seeing the whole map. And as you keep walking, you sense that what once felt like sudden interruption has become ongoing presence, guiding you gently, persistently, further into a life that is still unfolding, still inviting your yes, still shaping you through moments you have not yet recognized. Moments that even now are quietly preparing to meet you just beyond the edge of your expectations. In the end, what remains is not the memory of a single surprising moment, but the settled assurance that your life is held by a God who is both nearer than breath and greater than imagination. He has shown that He does not wait for perfect conditions, polished faith, or fearless hearts. He comes into real lives, interrupted lives, unfinished lives, and makes His dwelling there. The unexpected ways He has met you are not exceptions. They are revelations of His character. As you look back, you will see that He was present before you understood Him, active before you trusted Him, faithful before you believed you deserved it. And as you look forward, you will walk not with certainty about every outcome, but with confidence in His presence. This is the quiet triumph of faith, not that everything is explained or resolved, but that you are no longer alone in the mystery. God has shown up, He is showing up, and He will continue to show up, guiding you not away from the world, but deeper into a life shaped by trust, steadied by grace, and sustained by the unshakable truth that wherever you go next, He is already there.